Well, good afternoon and welcome to our November Ranching 101 webinar. Joining us today is Mike Nagorski, DVM and expert in optimizing calf health. Before we start, I would like to thank our friends at Lone Star Ag Credit for sponsoring this month's webinar. Please join me in watching this short video for some brief remarks.
I came down here about 12 years ago to work with my artwork and fell in love with the country and feel very fortunate to be out here. It means a lot to be able to pass this piece of property on to our kids. It's a blessing to be able to have somebody like Lone Star Ag to be able to help you be able to do something like that for generations down the road to have.
Thank you to Lone Star Ag Credit for their continued support. Before I turn it over to Mike, I want to remind everyone to join us on December 12th for our next Ranching 101, where we will talk about sharing our industry with others. Today, we're excited to hear from Mike, who serves as the Director of Research for Saskatoon Colostrum Company. Mike is a passionate advocate for maximizing the genetic potential of young calves through nutrition and disease management. His commitment lies in utilizing evidence-based approaches to influence and challenge research, offering producers the best solutions. Today, we'll learn practical strategies for ensuring the successful start of newborn calves and the economic and performance advantages of proper colostrum management. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them in the chat box or the Q&A box. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Mike.
Thank you. And you can see my screen okay here, I hope. But we'll go ahead and get started right away. I really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to kind of listen to what we're going to talk about today, which is really providing protection for our calves and thinking about probably the most important time period that we never get back, which is that first 12 hours of life, and how things that we can do in that time period to really set our calves up for success. And specifically, we're going to talk about, as I can try to get my screen moving here, we're going to talk about why calves need colostrum. And so, there's a lot of consequences of that. And we're definitely going to talk about what happens when they don't get enough, and then how do we do anything if we do need to intervene to help these calves out. And so specifically what we're going to talk about, and what's kind of interesting and almost a challenge, if you will. I know I've got beef cow calves operation with my brother back home, and the unique issue, shall we say, and kind of the challenge that we've all, whether we like it or not, that we have to face is the unique ability, if you will, of these calves to really find a way to give us issues with health. And if you really think about it, they run a fine line. And we're going to talk specifically about how passive transfer of immunity work. And I know that's kind of a technical type of a question, but cattle are very unique in that calves, okay, if we look at the antibodies that we get that provide protection for immunity, okay, if we look at the humans, so if we look at us as humans, we actually get some transfer of antibodies or immune factors to us while we are in utero from our mothers, okay? And so we come into this world with a halfway functioning immune system, okay? And that's on the human side. And that's kind of a nice thing, because it poses another challenge. Whereas if you look at calves, they get zero absorption, if you will, of any type of immune factors while they're in utero. They rely completely on colostrum, that first milking from mom, to serve as their immune system. And so we call that, it's kind of like that cow is going to pass on her immune system. In fact, anything and everything that she sees during her life, she builds antibodies to that, or immune factors to that. And then what she does is she concentrates those antibodies or immune factors into her udder starting about 6 weeks prior to calving. And so basically, that's why we call it a passive transfer of immunity. She literally is passing her immune system onto that calf. And because that calf doesn't get any absorption again in utero, okay, they rely completely on what they get from mom. And so colostrum is consumed. That's going to provide them with all the immunity that they need until their own immune system kind of takes over. And interestingly, this is, again, that challenge that we deal with. Who knows why Mother Nature created it this way? Maybe it was because if you look at how this kind of works, there's a lot of, instances of where this can fail, right? And maybe that's so that there's some calves, if it was out in, the buffalo herds that used to roam the prairies and that, it would give predators a chance to prey on some weak animals. I don't know, but we have to deal with this phenomenon, whether we like it or not. And so the weird thing with this is that it's not like this just happens adequately for every single animal that's born. And so that calf has to consume an adequate amount of colostrum from that dam. And interestingly, the calf's intestinal tract is only open to the transfer of these antibodies and immune factors for 24 hours. In fact, it's much shorter than that. We're going to see that here soon. But basically, once they consume that colostrum, those Y-shaped substances that you see there in that picture, those antibodies are absorbed into the bloodstream, and then they're resecreted back out into the gut, into the lung, to provide immunity to prevent against scours and respiratory disease. So again, let's say a calf's born and it doesn't get up and get enough colostrum, which is going to be its immune system for the first 3 to 4 months of its life. It's going to be very prone to disease. And as you all know, it's probably, we're going to share some stats here coming up, had a higher risk of dying and death. And so, you kind of always see this graph here, but basically the colostrum provides, as you see on the left-hand side, immune protection. And so we call that passive immunity. And then again, its own active immune system, so its own immune system has to develop, and that takes time, okay? So for that first, again, few months of life, that calf is going to rely on the immunity it gets from colostrum to basically provide its immune system until its own active immunity takes over. And of course, like we say, it's a time-bound process and it has to happen very quickly. So we talked about just previously how that gastrointestinal tract is open to the passive transfer of those antibodies or immune factors. Well, here you see in this graph, it's a time-bound process. And so we've always said we've got 24 hours to do this. However, as you can see by this graph, that really is not the case. If you look here, you basically got, it's very important those first couple hours that calf gets up and suckles from the dam, okay? Or gets colostrum if it needs a colostrum replacer of that. After 2 hours, you will see about a 30 to 40% drop in that calf's ability to absorb antibodies from colostrum. And by 12 hours, after 12 hours, it's pretty minimal what it absorbs, maybe only 10 to 15% of the antibodies that it's going to receive. And so it is a time-bound process. That's why it's so important to monitor these cows calving and to make sure that they get up and are suckling the cow. And we're going to talk about intervention strategies, but we don't have 24 hours. We've got basically 2 to 12 hours after that calf's born to make sure that this happens. And unfortunately, once that time passes, we don't get that time back. And you can't make these calves absorb. There's nothing we can give them to make them absorb. That time clock is clicking from the minute that they're born. Okay, so what is colostrum? Yes, it's the antibodies and the immune factors. It's the immune system, and we really focus on that. But it is actually indeed much more than that. There are tons of growth factors and hormones in colostrum, as well as lots of energy and nutrients. For example, vitamin A is almost 10 times the level in colostrum than it is in whole milk, okay? There's really interesting growth factors and hormones as well in colostrum, like epidermal growth factor. And these are like hormones that, for example, help to the digestive tract to develop. And so colostrum is very uniquely, a very potent substance for these calves. And it just can't be emphasized enough what all there is in it. There's hundreds and hundreds of bioactive factors, as we say, in colostrum. And it's not just the immune factors, it's the growth factors, and it's also the energy and the nutrients. And interestingly, colostral fat as well, very, very important for calves. It actually helps to the calf to thermoregulate. It's the number one driver to allow for what's called brown fat metabolism in calves. And so if a calf doesn't get colostrum, it also doesn't get colostral fat to help it thermoregulate, which is really important for these calves. Okay, so we mentioned before that, you know, basically that cow's passing her immune system on via the colostrum to the calf. And so you see that that's going to provide, again, immunity for the first few months of life. Okay, and interestingly, what we call it, let's say a calf is born and it doesn't get any colostrum, what we call it is failure of passive transfer. So you see that acronym on here, FPT, that's failure of passive transfer. Believe it or not, we can actually blood test calves, and we do this a lot on the dairy calf side of things, where we can blood test a calf and actually determine how much immunity that calf got from its mother's colostrum. And in fact, much of the research shows that if a calf gets below a certain blood level, which is shown on here, it's below 10 grams per liter of IgG, that calf is almost 4 to 6 times more likely to die before 60 days of age. So again, it's all, you know, we say it's all about immunity, and then obviously the growth factors, the hormones, and the nutrients that are really going to all act together to provide protection for these calves. So, you know, a lot of people ask, well, if a calf doesn't get enough colostrum or it fails passive transfer, you know, how often does this happen? And so there's been a multitude of studies that have been done in the United States, including in Canada, and we're going to share some of that information here. But based on results through our laboratory, where we've actually do blood test calves for the failure of passive transfer. So again, we're measuring the immunity that calf is getting from the colostrum from its dam. And what we have seen in studies is up to, you know, anywhere between 15 to 20% of calves failing passive transfer. We just did a study in Iowa with Iowa State University, and in some herds in Iowa, we saw as high as 15 to 17% of calves, and it is very herd specific based on dynamics within the herd, but the highest is kind of up to 31%. And so, where, if you look at your own herd, where do you exist on this spectrum? How many calves are failing? To be able to really quantify that, you'd have to blood test, which is possible, but the bigger thing is, what do we do to prevent it, right? How do we do that? Well, it's all about knowing what the risk factors are, right? So there are dam associated risk factors. And then, of course, there's also calf associated risk factors. And so if we look at some of the risk factors, probably the number one thing that we see is first calf heifers. And everybody, I'm sure, on this webinar here can relate to a first calf heifer with how they bond or don't bond with the calf. And then, of course, whether or not they have enough udder fill or colostrum that's available. And typically that's the latter is the bigger issue. Is typically with first calf heifers, they lack colostrum volume. And so if you look at a herd and you look at the number of calves that have failure of passive transfer, not enough colostrum, a lot of those come from these first calf heifers. And so they're a huge source of issue, shall we say. And if you look across, I think I do some consulting with a lot of beef cow calf herds, and we definitely see that. I get that. Hey, Dr. Mike, why is it that calves out of my first calf heifers don't seem to do as well as my calves coming out of multi-paris type cows and that have had multiple calves? And that's somewhat part of to explain for that is they just typically don't have as much milk and they don't have enough colostrum. So that's a big source of risk for a lot of these calves. The other ones are poor teat and udder conformation. Obviously, if a calf can't get and latch on the teat of the cow, that's a big issue. There's also cows that lack udder fill, and I would highly suggest if you have cows that have issues, these are the ones that do indeed need to be culled. And just because if that calf's not getting up, how much do you want to intervene there to try to encourage them to suckle from the dam? Well, when you have poor teat and udder conformation, that certainly poses a huge risk, as well as even udder attachment. So you see some of these cows that have poor udder attachment, meaning their bags are dragging in the dirt or the mud. We have a lot of mud up in Minnesota, so that's always an issue as well. There's all these different factors. Interestingly, a lot of genetic differences, believe it or not, within cows. And we learn that from the dairy side of things. And so there are certain cows that, just aren't going to produce adequate colostrum quality or quantity. And you tend to see that. And we've tested some herds where we actually see failure passivtransfer in consecutive calves from particular cows. So again, I think that goes back to, what we all know is putting some selection pressure on these females to make sure that they've got good udder quality. And really, I mean, if you start seeing cows that aren't raising healthy calves, they're going to tell you through that calf. And so just because, some of them just don't have the genetics to do it. And so those are the risk factors. The other one is nutrition. Believe it or not, nutrition heavily influences the colostrum. In fact, new research in the University of Guelph found that if we provide cows with more energy during that last 21 days prior to calving, we can actually produce almost a half to 1 quart more of colostrum. And what does that mean? Well, there's actually, when that cow, again, like I said, she starts producing colostrum for her calf in that udder, she starts dumping colostrum into that udder. That's an energy driven process. And so one aspect on the beef cow calf side is to not, I'll just say this as a beef cow calf producer myself, feed cost is a big thing. One area where we do not want to cut our costs or cut corners on costs is that last trimester, both in terms of minerals and also nutrition, and specifically energy. Why? Because we find that actually cows will divert their energy to produce the production of colostrum in that last at least 21 days in the studies that we've done. And so it's very important that we provide proper nutrition in terms of, minerals, nutrients, and specifically energy and protein to those cows in that last trimester. Because we're not only influencing calf growth in that time period and development, we're also we're going to influence that colostrum. And so those two can be issues with poor colostrum yield, and that we see that more in the upper Midwest, where we turn cows out on cornstalk fields. And we really got to watch out, because if we get out to where those cows are getting ready to calve and they're getting nothing but corn stalks, it's not going to be enough for them. And so that's another area where we can really make sure that we're doing the right things for our cows in the development of those calves. Heat stress and cold stress also can play a role with the colostrum in terms of the production of good quality and enough colostrum. And then, of course, there's calf factors. Dystocia. Calves that are born to dystocia are typically, they lack a suckle reflex, and they're almost twice as risky to die in their pre-weaning period due to dystocia. A lot of times it's because they can't get up and suckle colostrum. And so, as you probably, if you've dealt with a dystocia or where we have to pull a calf, a lot of times they lack that suckle reflex. And so if that's the case, that's where we need to intervene and get them colostrum. But that's a big reflex, a risk factor. Then delayed suckling, as we talked about time. Calf is born as a twin or a low birth weight calf, a weak calf, not breathing normally. Again, for whatever reason, could be weak. Hypothermia is also a big issue with calves, as they actually can go into shock and get almost in a kind of a comatose type state. They're not going to get up and suck in time, as well as hot temperatures. In fact, if you're in the southern part of the United States, you're probably going to deal with that more. Hot temperatures also will impact calves in terms of stressing them out. It also increases their respiratory rates. and just really puts a lot of stress and can actually affect the way that calves absorb the antibodies. In fact, hot temperatures have shown to reduce the antibody absorption from colostrum by as much as 35%. So all these things can, set up kind of a risk for these calves to not get enough immunity from their colostrum. Okay. And then, of course, okay, so we talked about that the risk factors for why this happens. We talked about the incidence, anywhere from like 15 to 31% of calves. The other thing is, well, what's the so what behind it? What happens when a calf doesn't get enough colostrum? And basically, as we said, a lot of the dairy research has shown 4 to 6 times more likelihood of death before 60 days. Well, there's a couple other studies that have been done, and actually even more telling in the beef cow calf sector. And one of these was done in Clay Center, Nebraska, where they looked at 263 crossbred calves, and those calves that actually experienced failure passive transfer, they didn't get enough colostrum, were 6.5 times the risk of getting ill, shall we say, or getting treated in the first 28 days of life. They were 3.2 times the risk of sickness prior to weaning, 5.4 times the risk of death prior to weaning, and a 35-pound lower weaning weight. Also, those calves, if we look across all studies, the 35 pounds lower weaning weight, that's typically on the average, but that can be even greatened depending on the environment and what we're feeding these calves. And so there's been a lot of reports that and other studies where they've shown that calves will grow at 2/3 the rate of calves with adequate passive transfer and feed efficiency, which is a big deal for us now, especially given the commodity markets and feedstuffs, that feed efficiency can be reduced by upwards of 50%. And this is kind of varies again between 25 and kind of 50%. But the main thing is that it is going to affect not only the mortality risk and the treatment rates, but also performance. And that's the biggest thing as we look at our cow calf operations is the mainstay for most is going to be weight gain, right? A new study shown, and this was just published last couple months up in Canada, where they looked at 420 calves from days 1 through day 7, and calves that actually in that study that didn't have enough colostrum were 7 times more likely to be treated before weaning, and then failure passive transfer calves were 18 times more likely to die in their pre-weaning period. And then again, like the other studies, pretty consistent. Other studies showed a 35-pound reduction in weaning weight. This study showed 40 pounds. And so that equates to about 0.2 pounds a day less than calves that get enough colostrum. And so very, very economically viable thing that we really need to look at and kind of pay attention to if we want to take the next steps with a lot of our beef herds. And so I'm just going to put up here actually a picture of this. And this happens a lot. This was actually a picture provided to me by a veterinarian who actually blood tested. It was actually some beef cross calves. Okay. These were beef on dairy calves, and, showed that, you see the one on the left. So these calves were born on the same day. Okay. And they're not twins, but they were born to different dams. But the one on the left, blood tested with failure of passive transfer, and the one on the right had adequate passive transfer. And actually that calf's feed efficiency was definitely reduced by, I think, 60%, almost half the size of that other one. And we see this so often with calves that fail passive transfer. And a lot of the issues actually come from the fact that they get respiratory disease. And that too has an impact on their development and performance as well. So, failure passive transfer, if you have it and calves don't get enough and they don't get it in time, it's going to affect health, well-being, and performance is the main takeaways, right? So how do we do this and make sure that calves are getting enough colostrum? Well, for many of us, we turn our cow herds out and we say, you know what, mom's got to do this. We're not going to watch them. I don't have the time or the labor. Some of some people aren't going to look at this, and I'll just say that, but for the ones that want to take the next step and really look at, if there's one takeaway I can probably try to instill in anybody, that would be to somehow find ways to monitor calving in that first 12-hour time point. And I will say this, that's one of the most important and effective means to really put some emphasis on health. And that's not via a vaccine. That's not via any products or anything like that. It's simply looking and making sure that first couple hours works. And when that doesn't happen, knowing what to do to intervene. And when you do that, I will guarantee it will have positive impacts on your overall immunity in your calves more than anything else that you can do for them. And so what do we do with colostrum then, as far as if we had to use a colostrum replacer? Well, there's a lot of different scenarios, but one scenario would be if calf's not nursing, and this is all a time-bound process, but if a calf's not nursing, it was delivered via C-section, if there's cold and wet conditions, mud, for example, is a really bad one, or twins, this is where a colostrum replacer could be used as an intervention strategy. Typically you'll see a lot of those colostrum replacers on the market. They're going to be anywhere from 50 grams of IgG in the packet all the way up to, 200 grams of IgG. In those scenarios, though, like what's listed here, and I will be sure to share the PowerPoint with everybody here if they want it. But those calves are going to need more than just a little supplement of colostrum. They're going to need a colostrum replacer fed within a couple hours of life. Again, the more the better, but somewhere between that 100 and 200 grams of IgG via that colostrum replacer. And so you got to look at the bag of colostrum replacer. You'll see it written on there how many grams of IgG or antibodies are in that colostrum bag. And so that's something you got to pay attention to. And again, in this scenario, like we've shown here, this would be where you would, intervene to provide them with a colostrum replacer. Another scenario is calf is up, gets born, is up and standing, but maybe it's just slow to nurse, where you could use a supplement. And so as you see on the bottom here, it just needs some help. And so a supplement will come in a bag that's a little bit smaller. And if you read on that bag, it'll say 50 grams of IgG on that bag. And those type of supplements are good to give calves just to give them enough energy to get up to then suckle mom. Okay. And that's where a lot of these first calf heifers could use supplements. And we do have producers that will give a supplement to those calves born to a first calf heifer. But I just want to make sure that we're differentiating here between a colostrum replacer, as you see on the left-hand side in this first scenario, and then in scenario 2, where you're talking about only providing like a smaller bag of 50 grams of IgG there. And then of course, scenario 3 is calf is born. There's no dystocia. Everything went well. It gets up, it's nursing vigorously. Dam and the calf were bonded, right? That's another big thing. You're not going to need to intervene. Okay. This is going to happen. Like I said, I would say, 80%, 75, 80% of the time, we're not going to be needing to intervene. But as we showed with the risk factor, or just the incidence of failure passive transfer, depending on these scenarios, what is it in your herd? And that's why it's important to really, I think there's a lot of value in monitoring calving, and to make sure that this happens right. And so if this isn't happening right, you're looking at probably 15 to 30% of the time where you're going to have to intervene and go with one of these, scenario 1 or scenario 2, and realize this is what we would do in the first couple hours of life. Okay. In these type of scenarios, if we go though, and we're talking like I said, 12 hours later after that calf's born, there's almost a 30 to 40% decline in its ability to absorb, right? So after 12 hours, we don't get that time back, right? So here's some other scenarios where it might need a second feeding of colostrum if it's not getting up, okay? If you provide feeding a colostrum replacer in that first 12, couple hours of life, typically 80 to 90% of those calves, based on our studies, will be back up and nursing mom. And that's the whole point. On the cow calf side of it, we're not necessarily always looking to provide all of the immunity via colostrum replacer. If we can at least get some colostrum into it via colostrum replacer, then that calf gets up and suckles the rest of what it needs from mom. That would be the ideal goal, and that typically happens most of the time. But as you see here, in 6 to 12 hours, let's say you go and you do intervene in that first couple hours, okay, and that calf's, for whatever, getting up and suckling the dam, typically that's going to happen with a dystocia calf, okay? There's where we might need to provide another feeding again to get that full immunity. Most studies show to provide a full immune system to a calf needs at least 300 grams of IgG via colostrum, whether that's from the dam or from a colostrum replacer. So that's why it's important to look at the directions and what's indicated in terms of the grams of IgG on those colostrum replacer bags and that. Okay, so as director of research for the Saskatoon Colostrum Company, we do actually not really manufacture, but we collect colostrum from over 1 million cows worldwide, and we heat treat it and we standardize it. So it is maternal colostrum in a bag, and Colostrix is one of those brands that you'll see. So like on the bottom right-hand corner here you see a 50 grams of IgG on it. And then we have another presentation that also has 100 grams of IgG in it. And those would be, this bag here is a supplement. So something that we can give as an energy boost to that calf so that it gets up and suckles mom. Again, very good for first calf heifers. And in this product, you can nipple feed it or tube feed it. But it's going to be for those calves that just don't quite have enough punch to get up and suckle and just need a little bit more of an energy boost. This is where we can use the 50 grams of IgG, and we call that a supplement. Okay, when do I need a replacer? So a replacer would be this 100 grams of IgG bag here as you see it. Again, that would be your dystocia calves born in the night where, from a convenience standpoint, you want to make sure that they get an adequate boost of immunity. Any orphan calves, again, twin calves would be another scenario where you could use this. Typically, one of the two twins is going to fail passive transfer. That's about 70 to 90% likely on most twin calves. It's just that one of them just doesn't get enough. And so that would be where you could separate off one of those and give them a colostrum replacer. Obviously, any of these high value calves or energy depleted calves could also benefit from one of these, as well as, for that matter, a first calf heifer. And when you get into this 100 gram presentation, you could even supply that, and that's going to really provide a baseline of immunity. This would be about 1/3 of an immune system, if you want to think about it some way, is the 100 gram bag there. So, that would be indicated. And if you do, like I said, have a dystocia calf, or let's just say the cow, for whatever reason, let's say the cow dies, unfortunately, and that does happen, right? What would we actually have to provide? Well, no less than 200 grams of IgG. So it would be 2 of these bags would be for that type of scenario, and ideally 3 bags over that 12-hour period. So, that's why it's important to look at that and know how many grams of IgG that we're providing here. And so I'm sure there's other scenarios too that we can use this in, but for the most part, dystocias are going to be one. And for whatever reason where that calf isn't going to get enough from mom, we're talking about using a replacer dose, which is going to be minimally that 100 grams. And that 100 grams, you're hoping that cow gets up, suckles mom, and gets the rest of it. But again, I just want to emphasize this. If we have to provide all of the immunity to a calf via colostrum replacer, we minimally has to provide 200 grams, which would be 2 of these bags, and ideally 3 of the bags, just to give them enough immunity to prevent failure of passive transfer. Okay. One other really neat aspect that we've actually been studying is actually the use of colostrum when calves experience some type of gastrointestinal illness, and specifically scours. And so we've actually done studies where we've treated calves with colostrum replacer, and it's had a immense impact on actually resolving their diarrhea. In fact, studies have shown that in studies that we've done, we've been able to reduce the days scouring by 1 to 2 days when we administer colostrum replacer to calves that are scouring. This actually, a lot of this came back from the human side, where, for example, in human research, bovine colostrum, believe it or not, has been used to treat traveler's diarrhea, E. coli in infants. There's case studies of HIV patients that actually succumb to the very pathogens, specifically Cryptosporidium, which our calves experience. And there's a case study of where a HIV patient was refractory to 4 different treatment modalities. The only thing that put him in remission was bovine colostrum. So again, there's a lot of goodies, a lot of bioactive factors that help to regenerate that gastrointestinal tract. And so we've been doing studies with that in calves, and shown that calves experiencing, like I say, scour specifically, will actually have a higher average daily gain after they're treated with bovine colostrum replacer, lower mortality, less loose manure, and reduced antibiotic use. So we've done a lot with that. And what are we specifically doing with like the Colostrix? Well, we're feeding 140 grams of colostrum replacer powder into 1 quart of water, and typically providing that for at least 5 days to calves that scour. There's a lot of times where calves will stop scouring within a couple days of even doing this, but kind of providing, around that 2 to 5 days of colostrum replacer at 140 grams. So yes, you do have to measure that out from a colostrum bag there. Want to mix that with 110 to 120 degree water. And then if the calves, are inappetent, you could tube feed it, but you can feed that with after the milk feeding, if they are being pulled off and fed milk and that. So very, very effective way of actually treating scours in calves. And so with that, I'm going to end there and open it up for any questions that you guys may have. Do we have any questions out there?
Okay, we had a question come in. How much is a passive transfer blood test?
So currently, we have a laboratory in Menominee, Wisconsin, and we are not charging for that test. We just encourage the use of it, but typically to test for it, you have to pull a blood sample from a calf that ideally is around 24 hours old, no more than probably 72 or 3 days old at the max, but typically 24 to 48 hours is when you need to pull the blood sample in like a red top tube. You can have a veterinarian do that for you as well. That blood tube then needs to be spun down, and we need to be sent the serum from that sample. 1 ml of that serum gets done, and then we perform what's called the radioimmunodiffusion test on it. Then we quantify the number of antibodies that they got from colostrum.
If I hold my heifers until they are 3 years old rather than 2 to have their first calf, is the colostrum availability still as uncertain?
So typically, it typically is. We haven't done a lot of testing with that, to be honest. I don't actually have a direct, like, I don't know of any research that's actually specifically been done to hold them to that. But what I will say is, I would probably advocate to make sure that we're calving our first calf heifers, by 23, 24 months of age. We do know on the dairy calf side, we've learned a lot from there as far as their milking ability as well as longevity goes. The other aspect, if we're not careful, if you're holding those heifers over for 3 years, would be the actually the development of fat in that udder, and that could reduce that udder fill as well. Other aspects along those lines, I will say that creep feeding calves, heifers, making sure they're not getting too fat in their developmental period, because they can put a lot of adipose or fat tissue in that udder, and that will affect both their colostrum production and their milking ability. So that would be something I'd be worried about, is the body condition of those heifers, both in the first year of life, but then also holding them over. But I mean, to tell you the truth, there's no study, I don't think, that's actually looked at what the negative impact is, but I would suspect it's not good.
Last call for any questions. Okay, well, it appears we no longer have any questions. We want to thank everyone who took the time to join us today for our Ranching 101 webinar. We hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.